First thing I want to do is thank the gentleman for agreeing not to watch Monday Night Football for at least a while. I'll try to get you out of here in time to go home for at least the third quarter, and maybe more. We'll see how it goes. There's books back in the back, and you're welcome to look at the books afterwards, and you don't have to buy. If you got a question, I'll be glad to answer the questions. But I do need to say that Tommy assured me any books you don't buy, that he'll buy. So I think he said that. Okay, let's talk about this. This is the book I wrote for young people and the interesting 20-year journey. I want to start, though, by telling you I spoke about this book at the Vantage, can you still hear me? The Vantage Retirement Community, West Fort Worth. And that's another story all in itself. But when you speak to retirement communities, sometimes they arrange a program every week. But when you arrive to speak and the program director isn't there, and nobody knows you're coming, it's always a surprise. So anyway, I spoke about the book, and before I began speaking, they said, well, you know, we've got bridge in an hour. Can you finish so we can play bridge? And I said, I'll get you out of here to go play bridge. So I didn't anticipate book sales or anything else much in the way of audience response, but did the old college try. At the end of my talk, this lady, elderly lady, came up and said, I want to buy one of your books for my son. And I said, that's really interesting. For your son? I said, how old is your son? He said, 59 years old. I said, you realize this is a children's book, don't you? She thought about it a minute and said, do you have one of those for adults? So, no, I did not make that up. That was what, and having no pride, I sold her one of the books anyway and told her her son would love it, and I collected the money. So anyway. As you were saying kind of in the introduction, in the old days, Fort Worth history was taught in public schools. It was taught as part of the third grade. They even had a textbook, which we'll talk about later. But that was 1967. For the last 56 years, Fort Worth kids haven't had a textbook or even a Fort Worth history unit. And I tell you this because it affects every city. Hang on a second. Remember Marco Rubio back in the when he gave the speech and he was drinking and they made fun of him? Sorry. So the last 56 years, there's no unit, no anything, because whereas Texas history is taught in the third grade and the seventh grade, there's no Fort Worth history unit. And if a teacher in Fort Worth ISD or any Fort Worth ISD, if he or she wants to teach Fort Worth history, they have to write their own unit and incorporate the unit into the Texas history. And since Fort Worth history isn't part of the STAR tests, you know the STAR test, right? State of Texas assessment, whatever. Since it's not part of STAR tests, why should a teacher go to the trouble to create a unit on Fort Worth history and teach it? But the problem that leaves us with is that kids growing up in Fort Worth, I mean, how do they know where Fort Worth got its name? Do they know? Does anybody tell them? Why is there a statue of somebody named Major Ripley Arnold standing downtown Fort Worth in McMillan Park? Why is he there? For that matter, why does Fort Worth have statues to Bill Pickett, whoever he was, and Quanah Parker in the stockyards? What else? Cowtown. Why is Fort Worth called Cowtown? And why is a panther our symbol? And these are all things that are useful to know if you're going to live in Fort Worth, even if they're not on the STAR test, but they're not considered important enough compared to, you realize our schools are graded based on how students do on the STAR test. If it ain't part of the STAR test, teachers don't teach it, because if you're a teacher and your students don't do well, then it reflects back on you, and it's just one big vicious circle. So things are very, very, very different. But every city needs an official history. In Fort Worth's case, in the early 20th century, they depended upon civic figures and people in the know to teach history. Fort Worth's famous library lady, Jenny Schubert, she was the great librarian. She said that civic clubs should, quote, compile a history of Fort Worth. Didn't happen. So what Fort Worth did in the early years, early 20th century, was depend upon old-timers to tell the story. Fort Worth ISD engaged a man named Howard W. Peake. And Howard W. Peake was, according to his story, probably true, he was the first white child born at Fort Worth, 1856. And so by the early 20th century, he was one who had lived all that history. At least that's how he told it. And so Fort Worth ISD engaged Howard Peake to go around to the various schools and tell them about Fort Worth history. And he told stories, and the kids loved him, and they were fun stories. It was great. But Howard Peake finally died in 1939, and he was the last connection to those early days. And besides, Howard Peake's stories weren't always connected to reality. But who was going to question him? If somebody says, I was there, I lived it, who was going to question him? But he did tell one story about this 1851 Phantom Comanche raid, when the Comanche warriors descended on Fort Worth and gathered up on what's now Summit Avenue. And Major Ripley Arnold, according to the story, wheeled out their 6-pound mountain howitzer, lobbed a shell into the Indians, and they scattered and went away, which is a great story, except it never happened. But there's still a marker up on Summit Avenue where the Comanche gathered and the shell was lobbed. And if you've been to Fort Worth, you know that from roughly the bluff over the Trinity, more or less where the courthouse is, to Summit Avenue, is a couple of miles. And there's no 6-pound howitzer that can lob a shell a couple of miles. But as far as I know, nobody ever questioned him about it. So that's how the story was told. And then 1967, when the Fort Worth ISD engaged two of its own, two staff members, to write a history. And that was 1967, and this is 2023. So it's been a long, long time. And this journey from this book, the 20-year journey, is what I want to tell you about. Then we'll look at some slides of some various important people in the book and stuff like that. This book began 2003. I wrote a manuscript about Fort Worth history. And it was written like the way I taught history on college level, only on a lower level. But still written, this happened, and this happened, and these people came, and this happened. That's the way I told history. And I presented it, pitched it to the Fort Worth ISD. And the superintendent at the time had me sit down with a committee to explain my book and get their feedback. And it was a losing battle from the get-go. They had questions, well, you need to change this, change that, we don't like this. It began with the fact that, well, Dr. Selcer, you say some of the Indians were cannibalistic. You can't say that. And I said, but they were. I'm not attacking them physically or saying they're bad. I'm just saying they were. Well, you can't say that. And then somebody else spoke up in the committee and said, well, you need to put more black people in the story. And I said, you can't just add people to the story because you want to add them, whatever importance they have. Mexican Americans, Indians, black, whatever, all you can do is tell the story. So that didn't go well. And that was 2003, and I retreated with my little manuscript, and they didn't hear from me again, and I'm glad they were glad not to hear from me again. And besides, the superintendent who had brought me in left town in a scandal shortly after that. It's happening again, sort of looks like. But anyway, so that was the end of that. So I kept working on my book looking for a publisher, and I discovered that not every publisher wants to publish a children's book. First off, they're called young people's books now. Not children's, but young people's books. Not everybody wants to publish one of those. And so that was a hard sell. And I talked to a friend, it was about 2011 or 12. Life didn't stop when I wrote the book. I kept writing other things and publishing, but I kept working on this, trying to improve it. And I had a friend who taught school in the HEB district, third grade, second grade, first grade. She was a curriculum director. And I gave Judy the manuscript and said, would you tell me as a third grade teacher what you think of it? And she read it, said, let's get together. So we did. And she said, Rick, I got to tell you, no kid is ever going to read your book. She said, no kid's going to want to read it. It's written like an adult. You've got to write a book for kids that kids want to read. And she said, you need to go back and write it and put kids in the book and write it from a kid's perspective. Don't write it from a grown PhD, whatever, old person history. So I went back to the drawing board and completely rewrote the manuscript. And in rewriting the manuscript, I created two kids who went on a journey in a time travel machine back in history. And they landed at various times in Fort Worth history and saw what was going on. Then they got back in the time machine and whooshed off to the next part of the story. And Judy said, that's much better. At least kids will read that. And I said, yeah, but if I don't find a publisher, they're never going to get a chance to read a book, because no matter how good the book is, I think, or you think, it's got to be published. The other thing a book needs, a young people's history, is illustrations. And believe me, it's not easy to find an illustrator who illustrates children's books that you can afford if you're a starving historian. I called a lady who had done, I forget whether it's illustrations, book illustrations. There's an award at the Caldecott or somebody, Newberry. Caldecott. She had won some Caldecott awards for books she had done in Texas history. She lives in San Antonio. She's an artist, and I called her up. I had a great talk, a great chat. She sent me some of her books. I called, we chatted some more. I said, would you be interested? She said, well, sure. I said, all right. She said, what do you pay? I said, well, I think I can maybe get a grant or a fellowship or an award or something, and maybe go as high as, $15,000 or something like that, just the illustration. She laughed and said, my last book, I got paid $100,000 for the illustrations. And so that was the end of our conversation. I thanked her and she thanked me, and it was a nice parting. It's just, she was, anyway. So then I began still casting around for an illustrator. And I called the TCU art department. I said, do you have any budding artists that would love to do like an entry on their Vita resume to do an illustration for a book that's going to be published and sell 1 million copies in Fort Worth? Every Fort Worth kid will read it. It's going to be great. And they referred me to a student. And I met the student in the Barnes & Noble book store, table, whatever. And she was excited. And her artist instructor said she was really, really super good. And this was at the end of whatever it was, 2014, 15, something like that. And school was getting out, TCU. So I said, listen, let me give you a bunch of my history books to take with you and give you ideas for illustrations. And she said, I'll take them with me. She'd go to California, and I'll be gone all summer, but I'll work on this all summer. So along about August, she calls me and says, I lost your books. And by the way, I'm not an art major anymore. I've switched to biology. So I said, well, doggone it, and some other things. I said, those were first edition books. She said, my daddy will pay for them. And I said, well, some of them aren't. So anyway, her daddy paid for the ones that were anyways. And she's a biology major, and that she's a graduate biology. Anyway, so eventually somebody said, you need to contact Darren Wright. I said, who the heck is a Darren Wright? I said, well, he's the sculptor who did the Panther. The one in front of the county administration building. That was Darren Wright's sculpture. And he's done a lot of other stuff. I said, he sounds like the kind of guy I can't afford. They said, well, he likes Fort Worth history. Give him a call. So I called Darren and talked to him and said, I need an illustrator. Before we go any further into this, I can only afford to pay this much, and I'm going to try to get a grant for that. And if you can work for that much and willing to do this many illustrations, because in a children's book, you need an illustration on about every page. You can't just drop one in occasionally. And I said, I don't want photographs. You can't, first off, old history, there's no photographs. Second off, if you want to engage a kid, you can't just drop a photograph in every 2 or 3 pages. So Darren said, yeah, let me work on that. And he went to work on that, and it was a match made in heaven. It took me almost 20 years to hook up with Darren Wright and to find out that he loved Fort Worth history so much, he would even give me the Fort Worth history discount on doing illustrations. He did about 80 different illustrations for the book. And he incorporated a couple of quirks I had, one of which was, to make it interesting, I said, Darren, how about in your illustrations, kind of like, Where's Waldo? How about putting a panther, slipping a panther into various illustrations? And he said, okay. So a lot of the illustrations here have a panther. If you look close enough at the illustration somewhere in the tree, in the cable, in the streetcar, under the horse's hood, anyway, any various things. And he did that. And he worked with TCU Press to create artwork and to do it with them. And it was a long, involved process, believe me, because his illustrations that I looked at in my manuscript look great, but then you've got to match them up, in the book. So it became quite a project, and came to fruition finally in 2023. And the last person I need to be sure to recognize is a woman named Linda Bush. And Linda Bush is the head of the FASH Foundation. It's not like I'm not stuttering. Linda Bush, the FASH Foundation. And I went to Linda and asked her if she would, TCU Press said, we'll do it, but only for this much. And to do an illustrated children's book, it's going to take this much. And so I went to Linda and asked her if the FASH Foundation would bankroll the book. And this is not the most exciting stuff to you, but to somebody who's been working on a book 17, 18, 19 years, this is good stuff. But her advisor, accountant, financial guy said, FASH Foundation can't do that. He's not a nonprofit. So my heart sank, and he said, I'm sorry, but the FASH Foundation works with nonprofit. You're not a nonprofit. And Linda, bless her soul, Linda said, how about if I pay for it out of my pocket? And Linda, we won't get into the numbers, but trust me, it wasn't like writing a check to church on Sunday and throwing an extra. Linda bankrolled this with TCU Press so that they would produce a fully illustrated book. I mean, illustrated books cost a hell of a lot more than not illustrated. And we got down to where they were getting to go to press, and TCU Press called me and said, by the way, this is going to be a paperback. And I said, you can't give children a paperback book. It won't last the first day they get it. It's got to be a hardback. Well, that'll cost you an extra $1,000 to do it in a hardback. So you see where this is going? I had to go back to Linda and say, Linda, you wonderful, but can you kick in more extra money so we can get a hardback? And she did, with only one caveat, only one condition that Linda gave me for doing the whole thing. And I passed it on to Darren. He said, okay. She said, I'd like you to make some of the people in your book look like my relatives, my ancestors, my father, uncle, whatever. And I said, Darren, can you do this? Because if you can't do this, then it's, we don't have a deal. And Darren said, sure, no problem. So some of the people in the book look like Linda Bush's grandparents, uncles, whatever. And I pointed them out to her when the book came out, and she was very, very pleased. In fact, she said the two kids in the book, she said, those look like my grandkids. And I said, well, I didn't tell her they weren't based on her grandkids, but you talk about the good Lord taking care of drunks, duffers, and poor authors, but just to make her happy. That was the whole thing. So we have a book, and I'm going to do there's a slideshow, and I'll show you the stuff. But I do have to tell you that I had dreams in 2003 that the book would be adopted by the Fort Worth ISD. That ain't ever going to happen. Fort Worth ISD books have to go through a vetting process with the Curriculum Book Committee in Austin. And what the committee in Austin does is to give every school, district, whatever, a selection of books. You want a U.S. history textbook? We approve this, this, and this. And then they choose that one. And there's nowhere in those approval of the state academic board, whatever, for a Fort Worth history book. So any Fort Worth teacher, Fort Worth ISD, Trinity Valley, Country Day, whatever, who wants to teach Fort Worth history and use this book is going to have to get it on their own. Which my dreams of retiring to the South Atlantic and selling, thousands of books every year, and it was going to be wonderful. I'm going to be drinking Mai Tais and counting my royalties. Ain't ever going to happen. But I do have to say, and I'm very proud of the book. And I don't want to make anybody uncomfortable, but if you believe in the good Lord's divinity and grace and whatever, my journey from Fort Worth ISD saying no, and if you want a second opinion, hell no, to finding an artist who did a good job for a price they could afford, to finding the financial backing to putting it all together was truly an amazing journey. And I give credit to somebody way above me. So anyway, that's kind of, so let me show you what we got here.
Is it in libraries at school?
It's supposed to be in school libraries. What I found out, you promote your own books any way you can, like back in the back. And people who self-publish, if you ever notice, they have a trunk full of books as they drive around, and they open the trunk and say, you want to buy a book. It's supposed to be in school library, but the librarians I talked to specifically, some of them I knew, said, well, we have a very limited budget, and we have to buy certain books because they are books that the teachers are using, and there's limited money left over for buying other books. So again, Rick loses again as far as librarians, teachers, but someday somebody will find this book and go, wow, a fourth history book for young people. Who knew? Who knew? So anyway, you ready? Okay, actually, if you want to, we can turn the lights down, or just, if you can see that way, that works too. How about if I move this out of the way? Howard W. Peake. Howard Peake is a man I told you about who lived Fort Worth history. Said he was the first white child born in Fort Worth in 1856. He grew up. He became a traveling salesman, which is kind of like an insurance person as far as believable. Anyway, he became a traveling salesman, and he wrote a book called A Ranger of Commerce, which was published about 1922 or 23. In A Ranger of Commerce, he tells the story about the Phantom Comanche raid, about some other things, and but he was the first sort of Fort Worth historian to actually take Fort Worth history to the kids. And again, he died in 1939. He'd retired long before that. But imagine when you were in school, I don't know if you went to school in Grapevine or wherever, but if some elderly gent had come around and said, yeah, I lived all this. Let me tell you about what it was when I grew up. Remember Fireman Bill? Anybody grow up in Fort Worth? Fireman Bill used to be, when I was in grade school, came around every year to the schools and told us about fire safety and all that kind of stuff, and he'd light something up on the stage and whatever. We all love Fireman Bill. I have a feeling that maybe Howard Peake was an early day Fireman Bill. Don't know. Move on. B.B. Paddock was the 5-time mayor of Fort Worth, a beloved mayor. He was head of the Spring Palace, putting the Spring Palace together. He helped bring in railroads. He was a booster of Fort Worth before Raymond Carter was even a twinkle in anybody's eye, B.B. Paddock. 5-time mayor. His record for being mayor stood until, what's his name? Toy Palace. Come on, help me out. The guy was mayor in the 1990s for years and years and years. Bob Bolin. Y'all, I forget y'all are Grapevine people. Never mind. Anyway, Bob Bolin finally broke his record, but B.B. Paddock was a Civil War veteran, a newspaper man, a booster, a promoter, a mayor, and if we hit the next one, I believe. There he is. Late in life, B.B. Paddock became a writer, and he wrote a history of Texas, Tarrant County, well, let me get this right. A history of Texas, Fort Worth, and the Texas Northwest in 1922, 2 volumes. It's some heavy plowing through it. But if you own a copy of B.B. Paddock's 2-volume history, it's a collector's item. It's a beautiful bound book, a collector's item. It's not the kind of book most of us would sit down and read. But B.B. Paddock, among his other things, was also a writer and wrote the history of Texas, Fort Worth, and the Texas Northwest. Move on. This was a 1967 book. Okay, students, we have a test for you here, an in-class test. What is the background in the book? There you go, there you go. Log Cabin Village, Log Cabin Village, back in the days. It was written by a couple of Fort Worth staff members. And the book is, again, it's a collector's item, not quite as valuable as B.B. Paddock's, but it's a collector's item because it's just so quaint and old-fashioned. It's full of stories about fearless pioneers and their wives taking care of the kids and baking while the men defended the homestead against savage Indian attacks. And it's the kind of history that some of us grew up with that is a far cry from realistic history. But again, from 1967 until the present, if you wanted to try to put together a children's history for your 3rd grade class or even your 7th grade class, your 3rd grade class or even your 7th grade class, this is where you started. This is where you started. Move on. This is my book, obviously, and I have to tell you, don't tell anybody, I have to tell you where the name came from. Anybody remember, or you've heard of Fort Worth National Bank, right? Back in the 1960s and early 70s, there was a Paschal High School student named Marcia Hatfield. And Marcia Hatfield was drop dead gorgeous. And she was hired by Fort Worth National Bank to do their song. And those of us that grew up in Fort Worth in the 1960s had it beat in, or got in our head, never got out. Fort Worth National, that's my bank. Only when Marcia Hatfield said it's a lot better looking. So looking about for a title, I thought Fort Worth, Texas, that's my town, right? Bless you, Marcia Hatfield, wherever you are up above. Totally unrelated story, but Marcia Hatfield I went to Paschal. She was 3 years ahead of me in my sister's class at Paschal. So little Ricky and Janet Lee. So Marcia Hatfield one day needed a ride home, and my sister said, "We'll take you home, Marcia." And my sister and Marcia sat in the back seat, and I sat in the front seat and spent the whole time turned around looking in the back seat. And my sister said, "Would you quit drooling?" I said, "Anyway." And that was the last time I ever saw Marcia Hatfield in person, but it had a great effect on my life, obviously. Okay, there's Marcia. See what I'm talking about? Now do you understand why I spent the whole ride home, turned around in the seat, looking over the back seat at Marcia? Probably why she never rode in the car with us again. Okay, anyway, that was Marcia Hatfield. These are my two time travelers, or actually Darren's two time travelers. And I said, create a couple of kids to send back in time to see Fort Worth history. And he did. And of course, Darren, being a sharp, wise, politically correct person, created these two kids because they're politically correct. And I don't mean that in a rude way, it's reality. It's reality today. Remember some of us when you grew up with Dick and Jane? And Dick and Jane didn't look like this. Dick and Jane, I don't know what Spot looked like, but Dick and Jane looked like your average white middle-class kids, which is what the Dick and Jane textbooks were that we began with in the first grade. But anyway, these are my two kids, and for whatever it's worth, these are the two kids that Linda Bush swore looked like a couple of her grandkids. In fact, when we did a book signing over on the north side back last year, 2023 in August, which is not the best time to do a book signing in August on the north side where there's limited parking. But Linda had her granddaughter do her hair like that, like the girl. And when they showed up, Linda brought us, look at my granddaughter. She looks just like the book, doesn't she? And I looked at Linda, looked at her, and said, she sure does, Linda. She looks exactly like the book. That's Darren's good work. So that's what the two kids look like in the Time Traveler. Next slide. That is what the time machine looked like. And anybody who saw the Time Machine, H.G. Wells, the movie back in 1958, anybody remember this is what I said, Darren, make the Time Machine look like from the movie, because it's really, I remember from 1958, I remember the Time Machine, what it looked like, to make it look like that. And he said, well, what if, I said, nobody's going to care. Nobody's going to say anything. It's not, it looks like it. It's not the same thing. We didn't steal anything. It's okay. Don't worry about it. So that was the introduction to the story. And there you can see up there above the time travel machine. And Darren came through with that like he did for so many things. Next slide. Now, I told Darren, I said, as long as we're having fun with this, we need to have fun with it. Kids are not literary critics. They're not book publishers. If a book isn't fun, they're not going to get past the first page. If there's not something illustrated to keep them turning pages, they're not going to read it. Unless it's an assignment in school, then they're going to hate it. And we want them to like this book, to like what they learn about Fort Worth history, cannibalistic Indians and all. By the way, kids love that. Third graders, Indians are cannibals? Now you're talking. It's only their stuffy adult anyway. So I told Darren, listen, work on this. So Darren, the last thing in the book shows the two kids on Darren's Panther. And if you've either got a book in front of you or really got eyesight, up in the tree is Darren Wright. That's Darren right up in the tree. And I said, Darren, put yourself up in the tree. And he said, are you sure you want that? I said, that's great. Put yourself up, because kids will love it. When they find a little panther in one of the pictures, they'll love it. That attracts kids. Your stuffy adult reader, blah, 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 but it's a book for kids. Okay, so turn the page again. One of the things I did add as a concession, whatever, to using it as a textbook is I put in an appendix with primary sources, because as amazing as it is to me, do you know they teach primary sources, primary documents in grade school now, 3rd grade. Now, they don't teach it like you do in college, but a primary document written by somebody that was there. It's a primary document. And I thought, if this is going to be a book, I hoped, in the 3rd grade as a textbook, it needs to have some primary documents that kids can read. And so I gathered up a whole list of a whole bunch of documents written by people in Fort Worth history that were short enough, simple enough for a young person, but yet were an actual primary document. A letter from B.B. Paddock to his wife back home. A man talking about an Indian raid out west of Fort Worther. His last letter, I forget his name. Anyway, he went out, he was a surveyor, went out west to survey the railroad and was killed by Comanche. Not the same story as a Fort Worth raid, but killed by Comanche. But he wrote a letter home the day before to his wife saying, we're out here doing the railroad. If I don't make it home, I love you, and blah, blah, blah. Wow. You know, sort of prescient, sort of predictive. And he sent it to his wife, and the letter wound up in the archives, and I found it, and so printed parts of it that would be suitable for a kid. And imagine that. I talked about World War I, say watching a parade of World War I soldiers march down Main Street. And all these things are there for a kid to read or ignore. If a teacher wants to assign a primary source document and give a test over it, because at the end of every section of primary source documents, I put some questions to guide, discussion question kind of stuff. And if it's not an assigned book and the kid just wants to read and have fun, he can read, skip that last appendix at 25 pages or whatever, look at the pictures, look at the illustrations, read the book, and have a hell of a good time. And that was that. So is there another one? Is that the last one? That's the last one. So that's the story, the 20-year journey from me and Fort Worth ISD to me and Darren Wright in a book and Linda Bush and a time travel machine and a couple of kids. And if you're 59 years old or older, you can still buy a book and read it. If you got any questions, I'd be glad to answer the questions. Otherwise, I will turn it back over to the people that are running the show. Yes, ma'am.
Do you have it in the independent bookstores or something like Barnes & Noble?
The question is, there aren't many independent bookstores. They're basically Barnes & Noble. The book is available. As the author, when I work as an author with a established press, a university press, they do the marketing, send out books, take returns, do all that kind of stuff. So I'm hoping that it's in Barnes & Noble, whatever the Grapevine bookstore is, whatever. Every once in a while, when I need an ego boost, I'll go in the last Barnes & Noble in captivity in Fort Worth, that on Hewlin, and I'll go back to the local history section and find the Selcer section and stand there and look at the Selcer section and go, yep, that's your life right there, those books. And if somebody walks by and say, have you seen these books over here? It's no pride whatsoever. Anyway, so if it's not in your bookstore, it's certainly available online. If you Google it, it's there. Other questions?
So what's the most rewarding response you've gotten from a young person who's read your book?
Actually, the most rewarding response, because speaking to groups like this, it's all adults. And hopefully the adults will buy some books for the kids. Actually, Linda Bush's 2 grandkids that were there, I figured, now, when you were a grandkid, if your grandmother dragged you to a book review, you just sat there the whole time going, can I have ice cream? We're going home, whatever. And they sat on the front row while I talked about the book and were interested and came up afterwards and said, wow, we like the book. Granny let us read it. We really like it. And that just, Granny let us read it. We really like it. And the fact they sat in the front row and didn't fidget the whole time or look around for food was, to me, a tremendous compliment. Hopefully, long after I'm gone, the book will be around. Like I said, that 1967 book, I had a teacher who retired a few years ago from Wedgwood Middle School or Wedgwood Primary School or whatever, Marge Sager. And Marge used that 1967 book to teach a Fort Worth unit right up to the 1980s, 1990s, whatever. We're still using it. And I kept saying, Marge, you've got to get a better version of Fort Worth history than that. So I'm hoping that someday this book will be around and somebody look at it and go, George, that Selcer and Wright did an okay job, we think. What else? Any other questions? Questions? If you want to come back again or you're going to come back and look at the books, you're welcome. Again, looking's free, and I'll answer questions, and I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you so much.